It started with a sound. Not a scream, not a roar, not even a growl. Something smaller, deeper, older. Carl Whitaker had heard plenty in his 67 years on this land. Elk bugles in October, coyotes yipping at the moon, the quiet hush of snow settling on pines. But never this. This was wrong. He paused on the narrow trail behind his house, coffee cooling in his thermos. The air was clean, brisk March in the Arizona highlands. The Mogollon Rim stretched behind him in ancient silence. Nothing moved, except that sound. It came again. A broken-throated moan like gravel stirred under pressure. It rose for a moment, caught on a breath, then fell flat. A wild animal, yes, but not fighting. Not threatening. Just exhausted. Carl took a breath. He knew the trails, knew every old mesquite and downed log on this path. But that sound pulled him off course downhill into bramble and brush that hadn't been walked in years. His boots crunched over lichen-covered rock. Birds fluttered out of his way. Still the sound came like a question asked too many times, with no answer. Then he saw it. First the glint of metal, then fur. Spotted, matted with dried blood. A shoulder rising and falling barely. Tufted ears flicking against flies. A bobcat, but not like any Carl had ever seen. He crouched instinctively, not out of fear, but reverence. The creature was immense. Easily 5 feet from nose to tail. Muscles coiled under its coat like cables. Its body was built for silence, for shadows. But it was broken now, held fast by an old steel trap bolted to a buried chain. Rusted, illegal, forgotten. The bobcat's leg was mangled, torn at the joint and swollen. Infection had crept its way in. A sour, sickly smell hung in the air. Its chest rose unevenly, but its eyes, amber and clear, watched Carl with quiet intensity. There was no panic in them, no rage, just stillness. Like the cat had long since decided its fate, and Carl had simply arrived at the end of the story. Carl didn't move. For a full minute, he didn't blink. He just stood in that pocket of silence between predator and human time and instinct. A man retired from a quiet life. A giant bobcat baby in size, but aged by pain. An animal once feared, now utterly vulnerable. And that's when something shifted. The cat blinked. Slowly. Deliberately. Once. It wasn't begging. It wasn't submission. It felt like acknowledgement. A wordless agreement between wildness and witness. Carl stepped back, hands shaking as he reached for his phone. His first thought, his lifelong reflex, was to call Hank, his neighbor, a hunter for over 40 years. Hank would know what to do. He always knew what to do with suffering animals. But Carl didn't call Hank. He stared at the screen, then with trembling fingers dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Arizona Wildlife Rescue Dispatch, and when the voice answered, he said only this: "I think you need to see this. I'm on the eastern ridge. Bring whatever you've got." He hung up and sat down on the nearby rock 20 feet from the bobcat. Not too close, just enough to be seen. He poured out the rest of his coffee. The cat didn't flinch. They waited. There's a moment in everyone's life, maybe only once, when the decision you make doesn't change the world, but it changes you. For Carl, that moment came not with a gun or a headline, but with a blink. From a creature that should have been wild and furious, but instead chose stillness. Real-life example. A few years back in rural Washington, a man named Jeff Monroe found a cougar cub by the roadside, starved and shaking. He could have walked away. Instead, he carried it wrapped in his flannel shirt 3 miles to the nearest ranger station. The cub survived. A rescue center named it Promise. No one ever interviewed Jeff, but he said later, "Sometimes saving something small reminds you you're still human." Carl didn't know this story. He never watched the news much, but something about that moment felt familiar. As if the cat, this creature that should have been nothing more than a headline or a warning sign, was offering him a different kind of rescue. This wasn't about size, or danger, or even about wildlife. This was about presence, and how sometimes when the world expects you to react in fear, you have the quiet choice to answer with grace. The sound that Carl had followed that morning. It wasn't a roar of threat, it was a whisper for help, and it had reached the right ears. The lesson here. Not every animal rescue starts with sirens. Some begin in silence with people like Carl, tired, unsure, holding more memory than muscle, but still capable of something radical, choosing kindness over fear. A fresh perspective. Maybe the most powerful rescues aren't the ones with flashing lights or viral videos. Maybe they're the quiet ones. A man and an injured wildcat. A choice no one saw coming. A moment that doesn't make history, but makes meaning. For the people who live alone, who walk the same trail every morning, who think they've already lived their biggest days, this story is for you. Carl didn't know it then, but the animal lying in front of him wasn't just a bobcat. It would become the bobcat, a creature that defied classification, that baffled biologists, that inspired thousands. But that came later. That morning, it was just two hearts beating in the cold, connected by something rare, mutual recognition, and a pause long enough for Grace to step in. Carl stood when he saw the dust trail from the rescue vehicle far off through the trees, the sound of tires over gravel, the faint rustle of boots. Help was coming. He looked back once before stepping away. The bobcat, still silent, watched him go. They'd only shared a moment, but it would echo for a lifetime. Because what no one knew, what even Carl couldn't guess, was that this giant bobcat was about to do something no one, not even the experts, had imagined. And it all began with a sound that shouldn't have existed. Next up. The decision that changed everything when Carl Whitaker ignored the advice of decades and made the call that gave the wild a second chance. Carl Whitaker had always believed himself to be practical, not cold, not hard, just realistic. He was raised on that land near Pine, Arizona, learned early that wild animals belong to the wild, and sometimes mercy didn't look like saving, it looked like ending suffering quickly. That was how his father had done it. That was how his neighbors did it. And that's what Carl always assumed he'd do too, if the moment ever came. But when he stood there staring at the enormous bobcat crushed in that old trap, something shifted. This wasn't like anything he'd ever seen. And it wasn't just the size, though the size alone would have been enough to call the news. It was the way the cat looked at him. Unafraid, not aggressive, just done. Carl remembered his hand hovering over his phone, his thumb moving toward Hank's number. Hank was fast, always carried. Could have handled this quietly, with respect. No one would have questioned it. The cat was suffering, probably wouldn't make it. And yet Carl's hand didn't press call. He hesitated. He could hear his late wife's voice in his head. "You've got more heart than you let on." Instead, Carl closed his eyes and tapped the wildlife rescue number. It had been on his fridge for 8 years. Still worked. Arizona Wildlife Dispatch. "This is Shelby." Carl's voice cracked. "I've got a bobcat. Big. Caught in an old trap. North Ridge. I think I know you need to send someone." He didn't try to explain. Didn't mention the size, the eyes, the stillness. Just gave his name and waited for the silence on the other end to catch up to the urgency in his tone. He hung up before she could ask more questions. Then he did something strange. Something out of character for a man who kept his boots by the door and his emotions under his hat. He sat down on the cold ground 20 feet away from the injured animal and just watched. That choice to call for help instead of an ending wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heroic. It was quiet, small, almost uncertain, but it mattered. There's a common myth about strength, especially in rural communities, that it's about toughness, grit, putting things down cleanly, as Hank would say. But that morning, Carl discovered another kind of strength. The kind that takes more courage, not less. The kind that asks you to sit with discomfort rather than run from it. Real-life parallel. In 2016, a farmer in Wyoming discovered a red fox tangled in barbed wire at the edge of his property. He could have left it called pest control or done what most would do, move on. Instead, he stayed with the animal for 4 hours in freezing wind until wildlife officers arrived. The fox survived. The man never went public. But local school kids named the fox Winter. It became a lesson in their curriculum how patience, not panic, saved a life. Carl didn't know that story, but it's the same thread. Because this wasn't just a moment of kindness, it was a quiet break in a generational pattern. His father would have ended it. His neighbors would have too. But Carl was tired of being practical when it meant being numb. He didn't know what would happen next, whether the bobcat would survive the hour, whether the leg would have to be amputated, whether the creature was even safe to approach. But he knew this. He couldn't be the man who walked away. As the minutes passed, Carl found himself talking to the cat under his breath. Not stories, just simple things. What the weather would be tomorrow. How the creek was running a little dry this year. How the kids in town had started planting pollinator gardens behind the school, good for butterflies, bad for his allergies. The cat didn't move, but it blinked again. And in that strange quiet, Carl found himself remembering something he'd buried. Years ago, before his wife passed, they'd talked about adopting a rescue animal. A bobcat kitten had shown up on a neighbor's trail cam, abandoned sickly. His wife had begged him to call the rescue center. He hadn't. It was winter. The weather was rough. They never found the kitten. I didn't call, he whispered now, but I'm calling today. The small lesson. Compassion doesn't always feel grand. Sometimes it feels slow, awkward, like sitting in the dirt talking to an animal that might not make it through the hour. But it's still compassion, still worth choosing. As the rescue truck rumbled up the dirt trail, its tires chewing up gravel, bright white paint startling against the red clay. Carl stood slowly. He waved once, then stepped back. A young woman jumped out, tall red vest clipboard in hand. "Mr. Whitaker, I'm Officer Delgado." "You weren't kidding." Her voice faltered when she saw the cat. Carl just nodded. Didn't have the words for it. She knelt near the animal, moving carefully, murmuring low and soft like a lullaby. "Jesus," she said under her breath. "He's a tank. Never seen one this big. Not even close." Delgado called it in, asked for sedation backup. A wildlife vet named Dr. C. Adler would arrive within the hour. Until then, they'd wait. Carl watched her work. She had a calm about her, a steadiness that felt familiar. He wondered if she'd seen creatures give up before. He wondered if she'd ever given up herself. After a few moments, she turned to him. "You know, most people don't call." Carl nodded. "I used to be one of them." She smiled. "Not today." That moment, so brief, so understated, would be the beginning of something much bigger than either of them knew. Because what lay on the ground wasn't just an unusually large wildcat. It was a story waiting to be told. A life that had somehow survived where it shouldn't have. A creature still breathing despite everything. Fresh perspective. Sometimes the real miracle isn't that the animal survived the trap. It's that someone decided to stop, listen, and respond differently than they had before. Carl didn't see himself as a hero. Still doesn't. He just knew that whatever happened next, it had to begin with a call for help, not a call for silence. The lesson has nothing to do with bobcats, or wild animal rescue, or forest law. It's about that split second of decision, the one that catches you off guard and shows you exactly who you are. It's not dramatic. It doesn't come with music or applause. It comes with a ringtone, a hesitation, a second chance. Carl made that call, and in doing so, gave the wild a voice. Transition to next section. But what no one, not even Officer Delgado, could prepare for was what that voice would reveal. Because when Dr. Adler finally arrived, the question wasn't how to save the bobcat. The question was, what in the world is it? Dr. Benjamin Adler arrived just after noon, the desert sun already settling into its golden rhythm. He didn't come with a press crew, no dramatic entrance. Just a second-hand vet, Vanna's soft-spoken demeanor, and the quiet assurance of a man who'd spent 30 years with wild things. Carl stepped forward as the van pulled up. "You're the doctor?" Adler nodded, adjusting his glasses. "I'm the guy with the needles. Where's the patient?" Officer Delgado led him down the short trail. She had already cleared the bramble around the trap and kept a slow rhythm near the animal's side. The bobcat still hadn't moved. Its breathing was shallower now. But its eyes stayed open. Adler paused when he saw the cat. He didn't speak right away, just stood still, studying the shape before him. Then softly, "That's not possible." Delgado had warned him, sent photos, described the size, but standing there face to face with a bobcat that looked more like a young mountain lion, even Adler was stunned. He set his bag down and crouched. "I've treated over 200 bobcats. This isn't just big. This breaks the scale." Carl watched from a few feet away, arms crossed, unsure what he was feeling. Pride. Fear. A kind of awe, maybe. The sedation was delicate. Too much could stop the cat's heart. Too little, and it might bolt, and that was if it could even stand. Adler calculated the dose 3 times before injecting it just beneath the skin behind the shoulder. The cat flinched, then stilled. Delgado touched her earpiece. Sedation administered. "We're good to move in 10. 10 minutes passed slowly. Carl knelt beside Adler as they waited. "What do you think it is?" Adler didn't answer at first. "Then I think it's the largest bobcat I've ever seen. Maybe the largest one anyone's ever seen." Carl's brow furrowed. "So, it's not a hybrid?" Adler shook his head. "Too early to say, but those markings, that coat, it's bobcat. Pure. Just oversized." He glanced at the paws, massive, thick with muscle. The head blocky but elegant. The shoulders impossibly broad for an animal that still retained the sleek lines of a feline. The proportions were right, just amplified. They lifted the animal together, Adler, Delgado, and Carl, and placed it gently into a reinforced carrier in the back of the van. Even sedated, it took all 3 of them to manage the weight. Carl exhaled. "How much do you figure he weighs?" Adler looked at the van's scale readout. 94 pounds. Carl's eyes widened. "A bobcat?" Adler nodded slowly. "A bobcat. Here's the thing most people don't realize. The average male bobcat weighs between 20 and 35 pounds. Rare individuals, usually in remote high-prey areas, can push 40, but 90. That's in lynx territory, mountain lion territory. And yet there was no evidence of hybridization, no strange coat patterns, no mismatched limbs, no telltale signs of interbreeding. Adler leaned against the van. "I've seen a few outliers. In 2007, a 52-pound bobcat was found in Oregon, caused quite a stir. But even that one, this makes it look small." Delgado pulled out her notepad. "So what are we looking at here?" "Mutation disease," Adler rubbed his chin. "Maybe. Or maybe we're just seeing a rare genetic roll of the dice." That possibility lingered in the air. In 2019, a biologist in Pennsylvania discovered a black bear cub with pituitary gigantism. It lived only a few months, but its short life helped scientists better understand how rare hormonal imbalances could manifest in wild animals. It wasn't a mutation. It wasn't radioactive. It was just rare, natural, and profoundly important. Carl looked at the sleeping animal. "He doesn't look dangerous," he said quietly. Adler gave a small smile. "Not right now, but nature doesn't make mistakes. If he's this big, he had to fight to stay that way. Food, territory, weather. Every extra pound meant more risk, not less." That thought stayed with Carl on the drive to the Southwest Wildlife Healing Center. The van hummed down the highway past pine groves and sandstone cliffs, past old barbed fences and dry washes. In the back, the Bobcat, still unconscious, was breathing evenly. Adler sat beside Carl in the lead truck. "We'll run blood work, X-rays, check for abnormalities, but I'll tell you what's already clear: this cat should not exist, not by the numbers." Carl stared ahead. Then why does he? Adler didn't answer. But he didn't need to. Sometimes nature doesn't follow the rules. Sometimes it writes in margins we haven't noticed yet. The small lesson: just because something doesn't fit the textbook doesn't mean it doesn't belong. In fact, the outliers, the strange ones, the anomalies often teach us the most. The facility was ready. Word had spread fast, not to the media, but among scientists, conservationists, rescue workers. They all wanted to know the same thing. What is this cat? Within hours, they had preliminary results. No sign of disease, no tumors, no hormonal imbalance. Just one surprise: the Bobcat's genome was clean. Fully Bobcat. No signs of hybridization, no indicators of deformity. A few rare gene expressions, particularly those related to growth hormone, but all naturally occurring. "He's a giant," Adler told the team. But not unnatural, not man-made, just exceptional. That word echoed around the room. Exceptional. Fresh perspective. We often reserve that word for people. Athletes, artists, thinkers. But nature doesn't play favorites. Sometimes it bestows greatness on a creature that no one ever expected. A wild animal. A silent survivor. A giant who didn't ask to be born different but learned how to carry the weight anyway. The team officially named the Bobcat Kodiak after the island where some of the world's largest bears roam. It felt fitting, not because of size but because of presence. Carl approved. "He's earned it," he said, and Kodiak had. Every scar, every torn tendon, every pound of muscle earned through survival in a landscape that didn't have room for giants. Later that night, Adler reviewed the blood work again. The numbers still didn't make sense, but that's what excited him, not confusion, curiosity. And with it, a sense of responsibility. This isn't just a rare animal, he told his team. He could shift how we understand Bobcat genetics, prey pressure, habitat adaptation. We're looking at a key piece of something we didn't know was missing. Carl visited the enclosure before heading home. Kodiak was resting on soft bedding IVs in both legs, breathing slow. But when Carl leaned in close, he swore he saw one eye crack open just enough to register him. Carl smiled. "Told you they'd come." The emotional truth. We expect wild animals to be unknowable. But in that moment, Kodiak wasn't a mystery. He was a mirror. Quiet, beaten up, still here. Carl reached into his coat pocket and left something on the table beside the enclosure, a folded photo of a Bobcat kitten from years ago, the one that got away. "You're not the first," he whispered. "But you're the one I'm staying for." Transition to next part. But even as Kodiak began to heal, one question remained: what comes next? Because saving a life is one thing. Keeping it alive, that would take more than science. It would take people, a whole town. Maybe something even bigger. Next, we explore how one silent giant brought a community to its knees. For the first 2 days, they weren't sure if Kodiak would make it. The sedation wore off slowly. His breathing remained shallow. The infection from the old trap had reached deep into the bone, spreading through his bloodstream like fire in dry grass. His temperature spiked, then dropped. The leg, torn and swollen, had gone rigid with inflammation. Every few hours, Dr. Benjamin Adler adjusted the antibiotics. They added IV fluids, rotated his bedding, monitored his blood oxygen levels. And still no movement. But his eyes stayed open. There's a certain kind of stillness in animals who know they're dying. Adler had seen it before, in deer hit by cars, in owls tangled in barbed wire. But this wasn't that. Kodiak wasn't quitting, he was simply waiting. Carl came every morning. He brought nothing but a book and his voice, sat in the corner of the recovery room just close enough to be heard. He read aloud, sometimes the local paper, sometimes bits from old adventure novels he'd once read to his late wife. The rhythm of it filled the space between beeping monitors and sterile silence. He didn't ask for anything, didn't expect the cat to respond. But on the third morning, something changed. As Carl read the last paragraph of a weather update, he paused for a sip of water. That's when he saw it. Kodiak blinked, then slowly shifted his weight. It wasn't much. A grunt, a shuffle, the softest of groans, but in that moment the entire staff leaned in. It was the first clear sign that Kodiak was fighting, not just existing. Fighting. Real-life parallel in 2014, a wildlife center in Minnesota rescued a timber wolf caught in a lake trap. It was emaciated, had lost a third of its fur, and showed signs of extreme trauma. On day 5, just as the team was preparing for euthanasia, the wolf rolled over and licked the vet's hand. That single act changed the course of its care and ultimately saved its life. It was later named Revive by the community. Animals don't always speak in movement. Sometimes the smallest gesture says everything. Kodiak's next few days were hard. The infection began to respond to medication, but it fought back. His fever climbed. There were moments, long ones, where he lay so still they thought they'd lost him. Vet techs rotated in shifts. They whispered, worked with dimmed lights, played soft sounds in the background. One technician, Marcus Grayson, a new hire fresh from vet school, started playing classical piano pieces through the intercom. Not loud, just enough to give the room shape. Marcus didn't talk much, but he had a quiet tenderness about him. He moved slowly, spoke gently, like he was always listening to something most people couldn't hear. He took the night shifts with Kodiak, stayed until 2 or 3 in the morning, and in those silent hours something happened. Kodiak began responding to the music. His ears would twitch at certain melodies. His breath would slow when Debussy played. His eyes would open slightly whenever Marcus sat nearby. On the 6th night, Marcus noticed Kodiak trying to raise his head. The effort was enormous. His muscles shook, his shoulders trembled. But he managed, just for a moment, to lift it off the pillow. Marcus slid a bowl of water closer. Kodiak drank. Just a few licks. But it was enough to bring Marcus to tears. "I see you," he whispered. "You're still in there." The lesson. Healing doesn't always look like progress. Sometimes it looks like surviving the hour, and sometimes the greatest victories are quiet, only visible to those willing to stay through the night. As Kodiak slowly improved, Adler ran additional tests. Blood markers showed reduced inflammation, white cells normalized, his hydration balanced, but the leg, the one caught in the trap, remained a problem. An X-ray revealed a clean fracture near the joint. Tissue loss, deep infection near the bone. It wasn't life-threatening anymore, but it was limiting. The surgical team debated amputation. Adler pushed for saving it. If he's going back to the wild, he said he needs balance. Power. That leg matters. The operation took 3 hours. Carl waited outside the entire time. So did Marcus. When Adler stepped out, his gloves still on, mask down, he didn't smile, but he nodded. He's going to keep it. They rebuilt the muscle, cleaned the bone, stabilized the joint, and they waited again. That night, Adler slept in his office. Marcus stayed late. Carl left a thermos of coffee and a note on the counter. Don't give up on each other. Fresh perspective. We think of wildlife as tough, untouchable, built for survival. But survival isn't always instinct, it's relationship, it's connection. Kodiak wasn't healing in isolation, he was healing because he was seen. And perhaps that's true for us too. Maybe we don't begin to recover until someone chooses to stay, to sit quietly in the same room, to believe we're worth the effort. By week 2, Kodiak was standing, unsteady, sore, but upright. His appetite returned. At first he nibbled, then devoured. Soon he was eating nearly 8 pounds of meat daily, twice the normal intake for a bobcat. And he began to watch. The staff noticed. When someone entered the room, Kodiak tracked them. Not defensively, but curiously. He knew the faces, knew Marcus's whistle, knew Carl's voice. He never purred. Bobcats don't. But there was a softness to his stillness now, not surrender. Something closer to trust, a quiet realization Kodiak had learned in pain that not all humans meant harm. Carl brought him fresh-cut newspaper articles, updates on local wildlife rescues. Kids drawing bobcats with big paws. One little girl's note read, "You're my favorite animal. Don't die." Marcus pinned that one above the medicine shelf. Real-world reflection. There are stories of war veterans recovering from PTSD after working with rescue animals, of seniors finding purpose in shelter caregiving, of children speaking for the first time after connecting with a therapy cat. Wild animals don't need to be tamed to inspire us. They just need space to exist. By day 15, Kodiak walked without falling. His leg, though stiff, held weight. His eyes were alert. His scars would never vanish, but neither would his presence. Adler stood by his enclosure one evening and said softly, "He's going to make it." Carl, seated nearby, replied, "He already has, because this wasn't just a medical recovery. It was a relational one. Every person who sat with Kodiak, who read to him, fed him, played music for him, was part of that healing. The deeper truth. Rescue isn't a one-way act. It goes both directions. Everyone in that facility was walking through something. And in watching Kodiak fight for life, they found their own quiet strength returning. Marcus, for the first time since losing his younger brother, started smiling again. Carl began keeping a journal. Adler applied for a new wildlife grant, something he hadn't done in years. Kodiak had pulled them back to themselves. Transition to next part. But the story didn't stop with healing, because outside the clinic walls, a small mountain town had begun to whisper about the bobcat who defied biology, the team who refused to give up, and a strange growing feeling that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The news didn't break on television. It wasn't trending. No big announcement, no press release. It began instead with a whisper. A child at Pine Creek Elementary brought in a drawing. Big yellow eyes, wide spotted paws, a bobcat the size of a lion standing in front of pine trees. The teacher, curious, asked, "Who's that?" The child replied matter-of-factly, "That's Kodiak. He's the wildcat that's learning how to be okay again." That drawing was pinned to the classroom wall, then photocopied, then walked home in backpacks. Within days, the story of the giant bobcat rescue had spread through the little town of Pine, like spring wind through tall grass. At first, people didn't believe it. A bobcat that big, impossible. But the Wildlife Healing Center had a policy. Visitors weren't allowed into the treatment wing, but the front office would share updates. One photo hung behind the desk, Kodiak curled on a blanket, his amber eyes half open, leg bandaged tight. People stopped in just to see it. A grocery store clerk started placing Kodiak-approved stickers on local produce. The owner of the bakery shaped bread rolls like tiny bobcat tracks. A retired nurse named Eleanor James arrived at the center one morning with hand-stitched quilts. She didn't ask for anything, just said softly, "In case he's cold at night." Carl wasn't surprised. This town had always cared more than it let on. What surprised him was how many people came. Quiet, ordinary folks. Mothers who'd lost children, veterans with tremors in their hands, lonely retirees, children with gentle eyes, all stopping by the center, asking if Kodiak had eaten, if he was healing, if they could help. The front office started a clipboard letters for Kodiak. They expected a few notes. By the end of the week, they had a binder. Some wrote prayers, some drew pictures, some just wrote things they were too afraid to say aloud. One boy, age 8, scribbled, "I feel like you sometimes, like I'm big and don't fit anywhere. I hope you get to run again." Marcus Grayson, the vet, tech, read that one aloud to the team. Nobody spoke for a while afterward. Real life parallel. In 2020, a community in northern Maine rallied around a rescued moose calf named Mira. The animal had been found tangled in wire, her legs scarred and swollen. But it wasn't just the injury that drew people in, it was her eyes. Soft, frightened, familiar. The town sent cards. Children brought carrots. One family set up a live webcam that reached over 2 million viewers. Mira became more than a rescue. She became a shared symbol for second chances. Kodiak was becoming that for Pine. At the school, the principal launched Wildlife Wednesdays. Every week, children learned about Bobcat's animal rescue habitat protection. One fourth-grade class wrote poems about Kodiak. Another calculated his body weight in math class. The walls were covered with words like resilience, wild, and hope. A group of 8th graders designed a t-shirt, a silhouette of a giant bobcat standing proud over the word, still standing. They sold them for $12 apiece. Proceeds went straight to the Wildlife Center. In one weekend, they raised $3,000. Carl came by to drop off a check for hay bedding. When he saw the shirts, he just stood there a moment, fingers brushing over the fabric. He didn't say anything, but when he left, he had one folded under his arm. The small lesson. Sometimes it doesn't take a speech or a slogan to unite people. It takes a living reminder that healing is possible and worth fighting for. Eleanor. James, the nurse, became a regular at the center. She would sit outside the observation window for an hour each afternoon, knitting quietly. Occasionally, she'd murmur a line of poetry. She'd lost her cat 2 winters ago. Maple, a companion during the hardest years of her grief. She wasn't ready to adopt again, but Kodiak became her focus. He doesn't need to be mine, she told Marcus one day. He just needs to know we haven't given up on him. There was something healing in that for her, too. Marcus started keeping a small notebook, Kodiak moments. It wasn't scientific, just things he noticed. April 6th. Turned toward music at 10:23 a.m. April 10. Ate with both paws for first time. April 15th. Made eye contact with Eleanor and didn't look away. Fresh perspective. Healing isn't just about the body, it's about being seen. A bobcat like Kodiak, wild, massive, unfit for any cage, could have been a threat, a burden, a curiosity. But this town chose to know him, not tame him, just witness him. And in that witnessing, people began remembering parts of themselves they thought they'd lost. The parts that still believed in soft eyes, in wild hearts, in redemption. Carl said it best one morning by the enclosure. Maybe he's not a miracle. Maybe he's a mirror. Not everyone understood. A few folks still grumbled. It's just an animal. What's the big deal? Are we really raising money for a cat? But they were outnumbered by those who saw deeper. By the time Kodiak was walking with confidence, the center had received over 600 letters, art from schools in 5 different states. A wildlife photographer donated a print of Kodiak silhouetted against the sunset amber eyes like firelight, which now hung in the mayor's office. And then came the bronze statue, commissioned by local artist Raymond Hughes, who had never sculpted a wild animal before. He worked in silence for 2 weeks, refusing to let anyone see the model. When it was unveiled in the town square, the entire school walked over in a long, quiet line. There stood Kodiak, life-sized head lifted toward the horizon, one paw raised mid-step, cast in soft bronze textured with hand-sculpted fur. At his feet, wildflowers carved with the names of children who donated. No plaque, just one word etched into the base, seen. The takeaway. In a world obsessed with noise, virality, and speed, this bobcat reminded a town of something slower, softer. The power of simply showing up, of choosing care over curiosity, of responding to the wild not with fear but with welcome. Kodiak wasn't a pet. He wasn't entertainment. He was a reminder that even the fiercest creatures can suffer, that even those who don't belong in homes can still belong in hearts, that even animals untouched by words can tell stories we desperately need to hear. Carl started carrying a folded letter in his wallet. It was written in crayon, signed only, "To the big cat who didn't give up." "I want to be strong like you." He'd read it sometimes before bed. He didn't always know why. Transition to next part. But as the town embraced Kodiak's story, a bigger question began to surface, one that couldn't be answered with donations or drawings. Now that he was healing, should he go free next? We step into the town's biggest debate, yet the wild versus the safe, and who gets to decide what freedom means. By week 5, Kodiak could walk the full length of his recovery enclosure without limping. His leg, once shredded by the steel trap, was scarred but strong. His muscles had rebuilt, his appetite had tripled. His eyes tracked every movement. He had grown quiet and alert, not from pain but readiness. He was in every way becoming wild again. And that's when the question started to rise, not just in whispers, but in boardrooms, homes, and schoolyards. Should we release him? It wasn't a simple question, because Kodiak wasn't a typical rescue. He wasn't just another wild animal brought in for treatment. He was massive, unpredictable, a creature that defied biology and expectation. Releasing him meant risk not just to him, but to everything around him. The town of Pine was divided, not angrily, just carefully. At a Thursday town council meeting, the conversation finally broke into the open. Carl was there. So was Eleanor James, Marcus, teachers, ranchers, wildlife officers. Even a few scientists from the state university had made the drive up to weigh in. Adler opened the floor with a clear summary. Kodiak is healthy. He's alert. He's strong. Physically, he could survive in the wild again, but that doesn't guarantee he will. Some nodded, others frowned. Then came the counterpoints. A rancher near the edge of town stood up. "We have livestock, goats, chickens. A bobcat that size could do a lot of damage. What if he comes back to us instead of staying wild?" A biology professor from Flagstaff replied, "We've studied his range. If he's released where we're planning miles from any human habitation, his instinct will guide him toward isolation, not people." A third voice spoke up. Sheriff Grant. Miles' broad-shouldered arms crossed. "Respectfully, you're all romanticizing this. That cat isn't normal. What if something's off in his brain? You want to put a 90-pound predator into the wild fine, but don't pretend it's not a risk." The room went still. Then from the back, Eleanor stood. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. "I was a nurse for 43 years, she said. "I've seen people come back from worse than a trap. We didn't lock them away. We gave them a chance." Sheriff Miles didn't respond, but he didn't interrupt either. Carl raised his hand next. "Slowly. I found him. And when I did, I had two choices. I could have put him down and walked away. Would have been easy. No paperwork, no arguments. But something about the way he looked at me, I knew he wasn't done yet. Now you're all asking the same thing I asked myself back then. Is it better to be safe or free? I still don't have an easy answer. But I know this. He didn't survive all this just to be stared at through glass." The room exhaled. Real-life example, in 2018, a black jaguar named Inca was rescued from illegal captivity in South America. She was blind in one eye, had limited use of one leg. Many argued she should be kept in sanctuary for life, but a team of conservationists carefully reintroduced her into protected forest land with GPS tracking and monitored prey sources. She lived for 2 more years, mated once, and eventually passed naturally. Some called it a failed release. Others called it freedom. That's the dilemma. Wild animal rescue isn't just about medical recovery. It's about ethics, about dignity, autonomy, risk, and responsibility. Kodiak wasn't tame. He never played with toys, never sought human touch. He tolerated his caregivers, respected them, but he didn't bond. That the team said was a sign. "He doesn't see us as his kind," Marcus told Adler one afternoon, "which means he still knows who he is." They ran a behavioral assessment, reaction time, Prey simulation, stress response. Kodiak passed every test. Then Adler asked the team, "What do we owe him?" Not what the law said, not what policy dictated, just that one question. The small lesson. Sometimes compassion isn't about comfort, it's about letting go. Even when you've grown attached, even when the world is full of danger, true care means honoring what something is not, what you want it to be. Back in town, Pine began preparing for both possibilities. If Kodiak stayed, the center would need to expand, reinforce his habitat, provide permanent, enriched care. People volunteered to help fund it. If he left, he'd be fitted with a GPS collar, tracked for 2 years, provided supplemental food if necessary, released deep into the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest, an area remote enough to support his size with low human density and plenty of prey. The debate continued. Letters poured in, some from far away. A woman from Oregon wrote, "Let him go. We all deserve a wild ending." A retired park ranger in Montana wrote, "You don't get many like him. The woods need legends too." Still others were cautious. A mother of 2 sent a note, "I love Kodiak, but I walk those trails with my kids. Please be sure." Fresh perspective. We often act as if safety and freedom are opposites, but they aren't always. Sometimes what's truly safe for the soul, for the species, is also the wildest option. Adler brought the final decision to the town hall 2 weeks later. "He's ready," he said, "and so are we." The room applauded. Some cried. Carl just closed his eyes, whispered a silent thank you, and looked out toward the trees. The release plan began immediately. A new transport crate was commissioned, larger, custom-designed, for a Bobcat of Kodiak's size. Staff began acclimating him to outdoor smells. They limited human interaction. Began hiding food to encourage stalking behavior. Used scent trails to reawaken his tracking instincts. Kodiak responded well. Very well. He moved with confidence. He leapt onto high perches. He stalked prey dummies in silence. He avoided human presence. Carl came by one final time before release day. He didn't speak, just stood near the wire and waited. Kodiak looked up. Their eyes met once more. And for a moment, brief and quiet, there was something like recognition. The takeaway, letting go, doesn't mean walking away. Sometimes it's the final, most loving act of connection. And the wild, it isn't the opposite of care. For creatures like Kodiak, it is the care. Transition to next part. The date was set, the forest chosen, the plan in place. Next, we step into the moment everyone had waited for, when Kodiak would take his first steps back into a world that nearly forgot him, and show us all what freedom really looks like. Certainly. Below is the full script for Section 06. The return to wildness, crafted with the same warm, emotionally centered tone, subtle mystery, and grounded storytelling. It maintains focus on action, connection, and gentle insight, perfect for your audience. The morning came quietly. No banners, no speeches, just frost on the meadow and the slow rise of sunlight over the treetops. April 18th. 6 months to the day since Carl Whitaker found a giant bobcat trapped and bleeding at the edge of his property. Now that same cat stood awake, alert, and ready inside a reinforced transport carrier, his body stronger than anyone thought possible. Kodiak didn't pace. He didn't growl. He simply watched, eyes steady, shoulders calm, as if he already knew this was the day. The team had arrived early. Dr. Adler, Marcus, Officer Delgado. Even Eleanor James had come, though she said nothing the whole ride. Carl rode up front in the lead truck, hands folded tight over his knees. The release site had been chosen carefully, 30 miles from Pine Deep within the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. Protected land, low human traffic, ample prey. Streams, cliffs, and miles of silence. Kodiak's GPS collar had been fitted the night before. Lightweight, solar-powered, and designed to fall off after 2 years. Long enough to track his movements, not long enough to weigh him down. By 9:10 a.m., they were ready. Adler stood by the gate. "We'll open it." And we wait. No calling, no pushing. If he steps out, it's his choice. Everyone nodded. Carl stepped forward last. He deserves to decide. They lifted the hatch. A gentle clunk of metal, then stillness. Kodiak stood at the back of the carrier, unmoving. Not afraid, just watching. A few minutes passed, then with the quiet certainty of something ancient, he moved. One paw, then another, slow, silent. When he stepped onto the pine needles, he didn't stop. He didn't turn back. But just before the trees swallowed him whole, he did something no one expected. He paused, his head lifted. He looked back, eyes sweeping over the group like a breeze across stone. His gaze lingered on Marcus. Then Carl. It wasn't affection, but it was acknowledgement. And then like mist, he was gone. Real-life example. In 2021, a rescued eagle named Flint was released back into the skies after months of wing rehabilitation. Instead of bolting into the air, he sat at the edge of the cage for over 10 minutes, just breathing, watching. Then with no warning, he leapt, spiraled upward, gone. His handler later said, "I think he needed to remember who he was before anyone told him who to be." Kodiak didn't need a reminder. He had always known. The small lesson. Letting something or someone return to wildness isn't about watching them disappear. It's about trusting them to re-enter a world that's not made to comfort but to challenge and belong. That day, the team didn't speak much. They took down the gate, folded the blankets, packed up the gear. Eleanor placed a small wooden carving near the trailhead, a bobcat silhouette, rough-hewn, standing on a curved ridge. At its base, a line of paint read, "Thank you for surviving." Carl stayed behind. He walked a few yards down the trail, listened to the wind, looked for prints. He didn't find any. But that didn't matter. He'd seen Kodiak walk into the trees, upright, proud, scarred, whole. And in that moment, Carl didn't feel old, or small, or unsure. He just felt present, like he was standing in the right place, doing the right thing for something bigger than himself. Kodiak was wild again. That night, the data came in. Kodiak's GPS pinged a quarter-mile from the release point, then a mile, then 2. By midnight, he had settled near a high ridge perfect for sunning. His movements were clean, strong, focused. Within 48 hours, trail cameras picked up fresh tracks. His prints, larger than any other bobcat recorded in the region, cut clean across soft earth. No limping, no hesitation. He was hunting again. Rabbit bones, feather tufts, signs of a predator in motion, not reckless, but efficient, as if the months of stillness had been saving something sacred. Marcus wrote in his notebook, Kodiak Day 2, thriving. The team watched his movements like constellations, trails of meaning across remote country. Every shift a sign, every pause a message. And what Kodiak seemed to be saying was clear: I remember how to live. Fresh perspective. We often assume healing ends with homecoming, but sometimes the greatest recovery comes after the return. When no one's watching, when the wild becomes teacher again. Carl began walking his own land each morning, just as he used to. He didn't expect to see Kodiak, but sometimes when the wind was right and the pines were still, he thought he heard something. A breath, a whisper, not from fear, but from presence. He hung the original photo, the one of Kodiak in recovery, on the wall of his study. Not as a memory, as a marker, a reminder that kindness doesn't require understanding, just willingness. The takeaway. Freedom isn't always loud. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it steps softly between trees, no fanfare, no spotlight, just breath, instinct, and the quiet courage to move forward. Kodiak became a myth in Pine, not because he vanished, but because he didn't need anything from the town anymore. And yet, he remained. The collar continued sending data. His range widened 10 miles, then 20. He circled streams, scaled rocky ledges, crossed meadows where elk had slept. He wasn't hiding, he was reclaiming. The wild cat baby they once called impossible had become legend. But what mattered more than his size or even his survival was what he represented. To the kids who drew him, to the nurse who whispered poems, to the vet tech who needed something to stay for, to the man who made a call when no one else would. Kodiak was more than an animal rescue story. He was a signal that resilience is real, that gentleness and strength aren't opposites, that nature still makes room for giants. Transition to next part. 3 months after Kodiak's release, something happened in the forest that no one expected, and yet somehow everyone had hoped for. Another bobcat appeared, and she wasn't alone for long. Next. What happens when legend meets legacy the moment Kodiak's story begins to multiply? Kodiak didn't return to Pine, but in many ways, he never left. 3 months after his release, a motion-triggered trail cam in the northern edge of the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest caught something surprising. 2 bobcats, one large, one small. The smaller, likely female was tracking close, sniffing branches, trailing behind the larger cat at a respectful distance. The bigger bobcat, the one walking ahead with quiet command, Kodiak. Even in grainy footage, his massive shoulders were unmistakable. He moved with slow precision, tail low, head lifted just slightly, as if scanning the air for a sign he already expected. The footage confirmed what the team had quietly hoped. Kodiak wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. And now he wasn't alone. That video made its way to Adler and Marcus the same day. They watched it twice without speaking. Then Marcus, still staring at the screen, whispered, "He found someone." Adler nodded. Or maybe someone found him. The camera caught them again 2 weeks later, this time near a stream. The smaller bobcat stepped forward, first pawing at the water. Kodiak followed. For a moment, their heads turned in the same direction, ears flicking in sync. Nothing about it was romantic or anthropomorphic. It was instinctual, natural, wild. But it also meant something more. If Kodiak was forming a bond even briefly, there was a chance he might pass on his rare genetics, his size, his resilience, the very traits that had made him both a mystery and a miracle. Real-life example, in 2005, a mountain lion dubbed the Ghost of the Rockies was tracked across multiple states. Larger than average, unusually elusive, it was long believed to be sterile due to a past injury. But years later, researchers discovered at least 2 cubs carrying the same genetic markers. That lion's legacy lived on, not just in the DNA, but in the myth that surrounded him. His story reshaped how scientists viewed solitary predators and the endurance of wild bloodlines. Back in Pine, Kodiak's name still lingered on lips and bulletin boards. A children's book was published by the elementary school Kodiak the Kind. It told the story of a giant wildcat who chose not to growl but to trust. The proceeds supported local animal rescue programs. At the Wildlife Center, Marcus added a new section to the visitors' tour. The wild room dedicated not to captive animals, but to those who had made it back into the wild. At its center stood a digital screen looping trail cam clips of Kodiak. His shadow, his steps, the amber eyes that had once held resignation and now held purpose. Eleanor returned once a month to sit by the sculpture in the town square. The bronze Kodiak still stood strong, silent, watching the trees. Tourists sometimes stopped to take photos. Others simply sat with him. Quiet company. Carl never said much about Kodiak's ongoing story, but he followed every update. He'd walk his property line and glance toward the far ridge, not expecting to see anything, but somehow knowing the woods were a little different now. One morning, he found fresh tracks at the edge of his creek, far too large to be normal. He didn't photograph them, just looked down, smiled, and whispered, "Still watching, aren't you?" The small lesson. Legacy isn't always loud. It doesn't need headlines or monuments. Sometimes it's paw prints where no one expected life to return. Sometimes it's a bobcat baby growing into strength because a giant once passed through quietly before him. The researchers confirmed Kodiak's genetic profile, 100% pure Bobcat. No hybridization, no crossbreeding, just rare expression of growth traits, genetic potential hiding in plain sight for generations now made visible. He's not a mutation, Adler told the State Wildlife Board. He's a revelation, and the question became, are there more like him out there? It sparked a wave of curiosity. Biologists began studying regional bobcat populations with fresh eyes. New camera traps were set, conservation grants were applied for, and in university classrooms, Kodiak's case became part of curriculum not just for biology, but for ethics in wildlife rehabilitation. Fresh perspective. One animal's story can ripple far beyond its range. Kodiak didn't speak. He didn't perform. He didn't ask to be a symbol. But in surviving and returning to the wild, he reawakened a conversation about what wildness means and how fragile its future really is. Marcus began leading school visits at the Wildlife Center. He showed children the medical records, the first trail cam photo, the x-ray of the shattered leg, and then the final clip of Kodiak disappearing into the trees. You don't have to be perfect to matter, he'd tell them. You just have to keep going. A new mural appeared on the side of the community center, painted by local teens, Kodiak in silhouette, standing atop a ridge, the night sky behind him. In the stars, shapes of smaller bobcats followed. The words beneath read, "Born wild, returned wild, remembered forever." The takeaway: not every rescue ends in captivity. Not every scar needs covering. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for the creatures we love is to let them be who they were born to be. Even when we miss them, even when we never see them again. Carl once told Marcus, that cat didn't just survive for himself. He made space for others to believe in surviving too. It was true. Kodiak had become something larger than a wild cat. He was a story, a symbol, a call back to the better parts of ourselves, the parts that listen, that stay, that choose rescue over convenience and freedom over fear. And maybe that's why he stayed in people's hearts, not because he asked to, but because he reminded them they could still feel. Real-world echo. Similar to how sea turtles returning to protected shores become signs of ecosystem restoration. Kodiak had become a pulse point proof that kindness, when placed at the right moment, could ripple through an entire forest, an entire town, an entire way of thinking. The GPS collar continued sending pings for nearly 2 years. Then one summer afternoon it stopped, not suddenly, not tragically, just quietly. The last signal came from a high rocky outcrop near the river, a sun-warmed ledge, the perfect place to rest. The team agreed the battery had run its course. Nothing more to be done. No panic, no search parties, no assumptions, just gratitude. For the time they had, for the story they shared, and for the simple fact that somewhere in a place untouched by fences or fear, a silent giant had left his mark, and maybe even more than that. Transition to next part. But even stories with endings can leave something behind. In Carl's home, in Eleanor's prayers, in Marcus's purpose, and in the heart of everyone who followed Kodiak's journey, something remained. A question, a hope, a quiet promise that wildness still lives among us. Next, the final walk, the quiet moment, and the message that turned a bobcat's rescue into a reason to believe again. Every morning, just after sunrise, Carl Whitaker walks the same path. He doesn't do it out of habit. He doesn't do it for his health. He does it because deep down he believes the forest remembers him. His boots tread the narrow trail behind his cabin up past the cottonwoods and down toward the old bend in the creek. The same trail he took that October morning months ago, the day he followed a sound that shouldn't have existed. He doesn't bring coffee anymore, just quiet. A hand in his pocket, a memory in his chest. He stops by the small wooden marker nestled beneath a pine tree. Just a carving now, simple, with Kodiak's name scratched into the grain. No flowers, no plaque. Just the earth, the wind, and the knowledge that a wild cat once lay there and waited for something kinder than fate. Carl doesn't speak aloud. But if you were walking with him, you'd feel the silence carry weight, as if it wasn't empty but full of memory, of gratitude, of everything that didn't have to happen but did. It's hard to explain what changes when you rescue something, especially something that was never meant to be held. Kodiak was never tame, never cuddly, never a pet, but the bond Carl shared with him, brief, distant, unspoken, left a deeper mark than most friendships ever could. It's what made Kodiak's story different, what transformed it from just another animal rescue emotional video into something people carried with them. A reminder that sometimes the strongest connections are the ones that defy explanation. Carl used to think wild animals were meant to stay wild, and he still does. But now he understands something new. Wildness isn't a barrier to love. It's an invitation to respect, to witness, to show up without needing to own or change or claim. Real-life echo. In Alaska, years ago, a lone wolf named Romeo lived peacefully near a small town often seen playing gently with local dogs along the riverbank. He never hurt anyone, never accepted food, just existed alongside people separate but connected. For 6 years, he was part of the town's rhythm. When he disappeared, the community mourned him like family. They built a memorial not to tame him, but to say, "We noticed you." Kodiak had become that for Pine. Carl reaches the clearing now. The sun filters through the trees. No sounds, just birds and breeze. He bends slightly, knees stiff with age, and traces his fingers across the bark of a young juniper just grown enough to cast a shadow, the one he planted the day Kodiak was released. A symbol of second chances. He thinks about what the vet team told him, that Kodiak's GPS collar went silent near a high ridge, that the area was thick with prey, that there were signs of pups, wildcat babies not far from his last ping. Carl never saw proof, but he didn't need to. He believed. Maybe that's the heart of wildlife rescue, not saving every life, but believing in the possibility that one saved life can echo, can ripple, can create space for others. The kids in Pine still write stories about Kodiak. One teacher said a student described him as the cat who made people feel brave again. Another drew a comic strip about a baby bobcat who wants to be like his dad, but keeps falling in the creek. It was funny, sweet, real. People from around the country still email the Wildlife Center. Some want updates. Others just want to say thank you. They send links to cute animal videos, but say none move them quite like the quiet scenes of Kodiak blinking from his blanket or stepping into the trees without fear. Those clips aren't flashy, no dramatic music, just presence, just truth. And maybe that's why they work, because not everyone relates to flash, but we all understand loneliness, pain, the quiet hope that someone will show up when we're too tired to keep going. Carl walks back now, trail crunching beneath him. He pauses one last time by the creek's edge. Sometimes when he stands there long enough, he swears he hears something soft footfalls in the brush. A branch snapping. A breath held and released. He never turns around. Just smiles. If it's real, it's not his to chase. And if it's not, well, that's okay too. The knowledge he carries now, that you don't need to see something again to know it mattered. That rescue animals aren't just saved, they save in return. That animal companionship comes in many forms, even ones without touch, without words, without years. Kodiak reminded an entire town what it meant to care deeply and let go gently, and that's rare. Because love often wants to hold, but respect says you're free. That's what Carl remembers most, not the moment he found Kodiak, but the moment he released him. Not the day they met, but the day he watched him disappear and knew he'd never be the same. So maybe the real lesson isn't about the bobcat at all. Maybe it's about us. About the moments when we're asked to choose between indifference and attention, between fear and compassion, between watching something suffer and deciding to do something even if we don't know what will come next. We all have our Kodiak moments. Maybe they look different. Maybe they come in the form of a sick pet, a struggling friend, a part of ourselves we're afraid to face. But they're real, and they matter. So let me ask you something. What's the moment in your life that changed you? Was it quiet? Was it unexpected? Was it something wild? Because sometimes all it takes is a sound in the forest and the choice to follow it. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a pet you loved, a time you showed up, or the kind of world you want to live in, then I invite you to stay with us. We tell stories like this every week. Stories about rescue animals. Wild animal rescue moments of animal love and the invisible threads that connect us all, human and wild, young and old. So if you'd like more stories that don't just entertain but mean something, like this one,